This video demonstrates how to use the Analyze Planetary Movement and Intervals mode of the Time Projections Analysis window. The Planetary Movement mode is shown first. Once it's shown, the Analyze Intervals is a subset of the features and will be easier to understand. I'm going to show an example of an oil analysis. So I'm going to start a new analysis. I'm going to select Analyze Planetary Movements. I'm going to select the oil symbol. The configuration checklist says that no zigzags are configured. So the first thing we need to do is show the configure window, this easy configure window, and configure zigzags for the oil daily time frame. I'm going to configure zigzags of 3, 5, 8, and 13%. Then I'm going to press save. The next thing is to configure the source of the pivot dates in this window, the date list. These are the dates that the planet projections will be calculated from. We want to see if planet degree projections generated from pivots of this market, in this case the oil market, are predictive of pivots in the future. So I'm going to use 13% zigzags as a source of pivots. So what you do is you right click on the 13, copy to clipboard, and we come over here and we're going to create a new pivot date list. I'm going to paste that. I'm going to call it oil 13 zigzag, and now I'm going to save it. If you look on a chart, you can see that these dates correspond to the turning points here, and you can do that by going to the chart, then go to the zigzag, and you can visually see the zigzags here. You can use the 8 or the 13%, but the more source pivots you use, the longer the analysis will take. You should use the larger turns as the source pivots, which is the reason to use a higher zigzag rate. You can modify these source pivots or use a manual set of dates if you want by editing the list. The configuration checklist says that no ephemeris has been selected or imported. You will not be able to configure the degree movements here or here until an ephemeris has been imported. There are 3 default ephemeris available: a helio, a geocentric, and a second geo with ecliptic intercepts. For this run, I'm going to use the heliocentric ephemeris and import it. You can test with multiple ephemeris to see which coordinate system works best for a market. After importing the ephemeris, the available planets and planet pairs that are available are shown here. You can test with longitude or latitude or declination. This ephemeris has longitude and latitude available. If you want to test with declination, import the geocentric ephemeris. For the purposes of this analysis, we will use longitude. I'm going to add 3 planet pairs. Let's add Earth Helio, Earth Venus, and Jupiter Mars. These are more or less just picked at random. The next step is to select the degree movements. There are 2 options. Let's go over this first option. I'm going to go over this, how this is configured, and what this degree movements this will produce. But this is a very wide set of criteria, which will take too long, so I'm just going to go over what this means, but we're going to use a different one when we actually run the analysis. So here we have 30, 30, 360, and 12 set. So what this does is it takes this first value here and it increases it by that amount this many times. So for 12 times it will go from 30, 60, 90, 120 all the way up to 360. So those are the degree increments that will be tested for each of these. But it doesn't stop there, because we have these two values here. What it then does is it takes this value, adds it to that to get 60, this first value, and then it doubles that for another 12 iterations. It continues to do that. It goes up to 300, and then, or actually 300, and then there's going to be another one in between here, 330. And then it finally goes to 360, and it does that for 12 iterations. So those are all the degree separations that will be tested for each planet and planet pair that is selected. What we're actually going to use in this demonstration is the value of 30, 2, 31, and 12. So what this does is, once this first set of degrees is used, it will increment 30 by 30 by 2, and that is greater than the degree end of 31, so it will stop there. So this is the only set of degrees that will actually be tested. The second way of configuring degree steps is to enter them manually in the CSV format in this box. I'm going to leave the window as a percentage window of 1% with a max of 7 bars. This is the window on either side of a zigzag pivot, where if a projection is within the window, then it will be considered a hit. Before running the analysis, we need to give it a name and save it. So I'm just going to call it oil.heliocentric.30.steps and save it. As a side note, when you change time analysis, even if planets have been selected, the ephemeris is not automatically imported, because the ephemeris files can be large. If you want to edit an analysis to change the parameters and rerun an analysis, then you will need to re-import the ephemeris first. Now let's run the analysis, and shortly after it starts, I'll pause the video until it's finished. It's now finished processing. We see on the left side of the results summary a list of the projections. The event description contains the source pivot date, the planet or planet pair, and the degrees moved. We then have the projected date, the zigzag date, and whether or not it was a hit if there is a non-zero value in TP match column. We then have the highest rate of the zigzag that was a hit, and whether the zigzag was a high or a low. Scrolling through these event projections, I see that most of them are exact hits. The ones that are hits are exact hits. So we have a projected date of 4/4 and a zigzag date of 4/4. I have a projected date of 11/22 and a zigzag date of 11/22. So what we're going to do is we're going to widen the window by setting this to 2% and rerunning the analysis. So let me explain a little of what this window is doing. The way the window percent works is that a 1% window is calculated for the first degree increment of each iteration. So in this example that we're using, we're calculating degree projections of 30, 60, 90, etc., all the way up to 360. So with a percent window, we're taking 1% of a degree movement for when it's doing Earth helio longitude. We're doing 30 degree movement of Earth helio longitude and taking 1% of that, and then calculating the window with the same one for the rest of it. Then when we calculate Earth Venus, we take 1% of a 30 degree movement of an Earth Venus longitude and use the same window for the rest of in the iteration. Same with the Jupiter Mars. We take 1% of a 30 degree movement of Jupiter Mars, and that's the window, and it's used for the rest in the iteration. So when using a percent window, the size of the window varies according to how slow or fast the planets being analyzed move. This needs to be this way because you want to have a wider window for the slower moving planets and not as wide for the faster moving planets. As another example of how this works, let's go back to the settings of the 30, 30, 360, 12. With these settings, all these iterations are going to be processed. And so for the first example, we're going to be using a 1% window, 1% of a 30 degree movement of the planet applied to all these degrees. For the next one, it's going to be 1% of a 60 degree movement applied to all these, and so on, until we get down here where it would be a 1% of a 360 degree move for the planet, and that's applied to all these degree movements. And then we also have this parameter here, which is a max. So I'm saying that the max it can be is 7 days or 7 bars. So let's go back. We're going to set this to 2%, and let's rerun the analysis, and I'll pause the recording when it's finished. The processing has finished. Looking at the events, we can see that there are some projections within a day or two of the zigzag date, so this is better. 5/18, 5/19, 8/4, 8/5. Looking at the right side, we see that it shows a 30 degree movements of Jupiter Mars have an 83% hit rate with an event count of 6. Let's look at these events by filtering on 625 Jupiter Mars in the left window. And then we'll take a look at it visually on the chart. I've imported the heliocentric ephemeris. Using the Planet Time Projections tab, I've set up a source pivot of 625, 2014. There are 30 degree movements configured. I'll select the Jupiter Mars planet combination, and I'll generate the projections. Keep in mind that the minimum zigzag configured for this analysis is 3%. We see that 3 of the 5 hits are 3% moves. However, this is one of the parameters that can be varied, and you can run an analysis where the smallest zigzag rate is more than 3%, say 5% for example. So we see here that the next occurrence of this will be on September 2nd. there are three forms that the results in the right-hand side can take. The first one is one that we've already shown, a hit percent on a particular source pivot, a planet, and a degree movement. The second type is a source pivot with a degree movement. So here we have a source pivot and a degree movement. This one does not specify a planet. When it takes this form, it means that this is the result for all 30-degree movements from this source pivot. In other words, the hit percent for 30-degree movements from 1/15/2015 of Earth-Helio, Earth-Venus, and Jupiter-Mars is 53%. The third type of planet, or the third type of form that it can take, is a planet with a degree movement. So this Earth-Helio 30 means that Earth 30-degree movements over all the source pivots tested had only a 34% hit rate. There were 437 events. As you test more planet degree movements and vary the window, you can find the most effective astro combinations that a market is responding to. Let's do an example of Analyze Intervals mode. This mode is very similar to the planetary movements in that it tests for hits from source pivots of a market, but instead of moving degrees of planets, it moves calendar days. When you run Analyze Intervals, the configuration checklist requires that you have zigzags configured for the symbol time frame. Then you select a source pivot. We'll use the same 13% zigzag pivot list on oil. Next, you select the interval list. The list of intervals will be projected forward from the source pivots, and then the projected dates will be put in the event list, and then it will calculate the hit percent. Some of the predefined interval lists include Fibonacci, Lucas, spiral calendar, squares of natural numbers. You can configure your own interval list or edit these existing ones. Let's apply the Fibonacci interval list. The results show that 9/22/2008 pivot has a 78% hit rate. So let's take a look at this one and the 1/15/2015 on the chart. So the first one is a 1/15/2015. We have the Fibonacci projections or intervals selected. Let's generate the projections, and we see the projections here. If we filter here on 1/15/2015, we can see the match, the zigzag date that it matched, that it hit, and the rate of change of the zigzags. Now let's look at the 9/22/2008. We can see that the next projection in this sequence is in 1019 or 1020, in that general area.